Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Compassion Project. I always have to think about what are we calling this? It's the Compassion Project. It's part of our Compass work, which is coaching or mentoring for providers affected by stress and strain. Those are the clinicians and caregivers among us who experience trauma often on a daily basis. And with us today is someone with Michonne and I should say. I'll back up and say I'm Dr. Danielle Lord. Happy to be back with you, joined once again by my co-founder, Michonne. Uh, Hypnotherapist, founder of Rooted to Rise Coaching. And today we are joined by one of our Compass coaches, and that is someone who knows what it's like to be in the trenches as an RN, a nurse, and experienced burnout, and now turned burnout coach for all those nurses and caregivers and clinicians who are experiencing burnout. So Betty, welcome to the show. So happy to
Thank
have you
you.
as part of Compass. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It makes me really happy to know there are people um, in the world that are interested in this work and taking the steps to actually act on providing this. So yeah, I've been a nurse for 20, almost 21 years. And I've always known that I was going to be in healthcare. Like growing up, I was always kind of drawn to the medical field. And so when I got into being a nurse, I thought, this is perfect. This is where I'm going to be my whole life, and this is going to be great, right? Um, and then I experienced the trauma and the
Yeah.
just the stress. And when I got into nursing 20 years ago, we didn't talk about stress. We didn't talk about decision fatigue, compassion fatigue. We didn't talk about moral injury. We didn't talk about any of that. Nobody was talking about that. And so when you had a stressful day, you went home and drank. That was what I was taught,
Mm,
right? That was the
wow.
joke, that was what was lived. That was what my mentors, you either
Just go home and
go,
drink.
you go home and drink until you can sleep,
Wow.
or we had people who just it was like you're all or nothing. You're either here, you never take a day off, or they would get so jaded that they would just, even when they
Wow.
were there, they were checked out, right?
Yeah.
And I think I did a good job because I grew up in a very um, fairly positive mindset home. I was able to kind of keep my footing for quite a while. But about 15-ish years in, um, yeah, about 15 years in, I had a couple of really traumatic experiences.
Mm,
And on top of just the everyday stress, then adding on a little bit of PTSD, and what I'm now learning is also moral injury. It was kind of like
mm,
the the trifecta that a lot of
mm.
healthcare professionals experience. So you've got the
Yeah.
burnout where you're just depleted. You've got the moral injury where you're being asked to do more and more with less and less and not be able to provide the care you want to provide. Um, and then just having traumatic events like you were saying. And so for myself, I was like, I can't keep doing this, right? I need
Yeah.
something. And I found life coaching. And so this was really interesting to me because I'd heard of therapists and counselors. And I was like, but I'm still functional. I thought, I don't need a therapist. I'm functional, right? Well, come to find out, a good therapist can help people who are functional too. But anyway, but in my mindset, I was like, who helps the people who don't need to be on, like, I didn't need prescription antidepressants. I wasn't to the point where I needed like big interventions. So I found a life coach though. And just learning those like mindset and they weren't specific for healthcare. So she didn't really understand my
Mm,
healthcare background.
hmm.
Um, but I did learn a couple of tools and techniques that I was like, oh, let me apply this to work at the hospital. And it was like, oh, okay. And I was able to really come to a place where I forgave myself for certain things and for behaviors and like just
Hmm.
the understanding of like, oh, that's why I did that, right? That's
Hmm.
why I couldn't let that experience go. It's because I was experiencing it as trauma and I was replaying it because my brain was trying to make sense of the trauma and all
Mm,
this stuff,
yeah. Yeah.
which which if I had gone to a therapist would have solved the problem too, right? They would have had those tools as well. But what I found is I it was that was my path into
Yeah.
I can be okay. I can get to a point where I feel okay again, right? So all of that to say, when I got my footing under me, I was like, nurses need this. Like, nurses aren't still 20 years later, they're not talking about this in ways that are productive. And I'm like, let's do this. So I'm still working full time as an RN, but I'm also coaching from a life coach perspective, from a burnout perspective of let's just get your feet under you. Let's get you to a place where
Mhm.
you trust your own boundaries again, right? And where you
Mhm.
can just support yourself emotionally first so that you can help everybody else, right?
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
anyway, that's a long,
No.
rambling answer to what do I do? I help nurses because I was there.
Well, and what I really love about what you shared, Betty, is that you still are there.
Yeah.
And this growth process doesn't have a period at the end. It has, an ellipsis, right? It's just like
Yeah.
what fills in next,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And being able to say, I've been there and I understand the 15-year mark, the 20-year mark, and you're gonna be at a 25-year mark. And to be able to take people on that same journey
Yeah.
as as somewhere in your span, they will probably have covered the same ground you have.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I like that.
It's fun. So I do in my business, I have coached everybody from um 18 years old. I think the oldest person I've coached, I think, is just turned 81.
Wow.
And not all of them have been nurses, and not
Yeah.
and obviously some of them have been retired. Um, but but the cool thing is from that perspective of nurses learn how to hold space for people, right? And how to care for people without judgment. And I think that those nursing skills that I have honed over 20 years have translated into life coaching really well. Because I can hold space for, yeah,
Mhm.
I've been there, or maybe I haven't been there, but I see you and I see what you're dealing with, and let's hold space for all of it. So yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's fantastic. I know that, well, I have interviewed Dr. Jenny Byrne, who's the author of Moral Injury.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so that's a whole fascinating realm in and of
Hmm.
itself. And I
Hmm.
think that especially the way things are going right now in healthcare with AI driving a lot of the decision making. I
Hmm.
heard today that insurers are denying anesthesia.
I heard about that.
Yep. In certain
I heard
states,
about
I
that.
heard about that
So
too.
I think that we're going to start to see more and more of that moral injury
Right.
play into some of this. But what I've kind of come to the conclusion of the last couple of months, and I'd like your insights on this, is we talk about PTSD, we talk about burnout, we talk about compassion fatigue. Of the three, which do you think is the most damaging
Mm, that's a good
to us,
question.
to patients, to
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the one so that's an interesting question. I think compassion fatigue is a symptom um of the damage that happens when we experience uh, PTSD and moral injury. But I think the most damaging, I think obviously that's a judgment statement. I think it depends on the person. Um, but so often traumatic events um,
Mhm.
and just being asked to work really, really hard without rest, without breaks. Um, so more of that fatigue, burnout. Those are the sneaky injuries, right?
mm,
Moral injury
mhm,
often is
mm,
kind of in your face, and you're like, wow, no, I'm not dealing with that. It's a little easier to notice when it happens, or at least see it and not internalize it. Whereas trauma and um, just burnout fatigue, because the way I think about burnout is just a depletion, right? You are depleted of your moral, energetic, emotional, spiritual energy. You're just depleted. So, so trauma and burnout really are kind of sneaky because the way I experienced it, um, I had a one specifically, there were several leading up to it. One specifically, I lost a patient and it was at the beginning of my shift, very
Mm.
traumatic. The CPR was very traumatic. The way the family showed up, it was all just a very, very chaotic, very traumatic thing. And then the way that I was not supported by my facility, the facility that I worked for they're amazing people, but and they have a assistance employee assistance program, but that's a whole nother discussion. I was never encouraged to care for myself in that moment. I talked to a couple of senior nurses and they said, yeah, this is perfectly normal to be upset. You're okay. You've got this. I said, oh, okay.
That's about
But
all.
I,
Wow.
Yeah,
but
just go
I,
be upset. Take a
you're
few minutes
fine.
in the bathroom. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's normal to be upset. Okay, bye. What I found out after I got help was that I had internalized that and started to doubt my skills. I began to have this internal dialogue of, I'm losing it as a nurse.
Mm.
I'm
Mm,
not on it anymore. If I had been on it, I wouldn't have
mm,
lost that patient.
Oh, wow.
Right.
So
right,
you
And
really
right.
took that.
so it was sneaky. It got like inside my brain and made me question myself in a way that I had a patient um, uh, just same about that same time. I had a patient who really needed to go to the ICU, and for essentially my whole shift, 12 hours, I kept being told, "Well, we don't have anybody to staff. Like, we can't take them. You're just going to have to care for them on the floor." And I'm like, "They're not appropriate for my floor. They need to go to ICU, right?" And that was a very high degree of stress. And I would consider that similar to like moral injury. Um, but I didn't internalize that. It wasn't me being a bad nurse, right?
Right.
Mm,
So I think in terms of injury to our nurses and our doctors and our CNAs and like the people caring for patients, I think that burnout and the traumatic events that we experience, those could be handled so much better to keep it from becoming an internalized problem for the staff.
Yeah. Wow.
wow.
That was really
Definitely.
insightful.
Yeah.
I liken from your story being in that abusive marriage, right? And yeah, and it just kind of eventually it's become so a part of what you do and that questioning that you go through and all that entails of being in that with that insidious kind of nature where it just
Mhm,
kind of creeps
mhm.
in slowly over time and eventually you just don't even realize it that you're in it because
Yeah.
it's
Right.
you've become so sucked in. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
wow. Yeah.
If I had had the skills that I have now, the I know how to support myself emotionally. I know how to replenish my energy. I know how to set boundaries. I know who to reach out to when I'm
Yeah.
hurting and when I'm upset. If I had had those things in place when I lost that patient, I never would have internalized that as I must be losing it as a
Yeah.
nurse. I'm
Yeah.
not
Right.
a good nurse anymore, right? But I didn't have those skills. And that's what happens with trauma, right? Is when we experience something and we don't have the skills to
Mhm.
process it, it becomes that traumatic
Yeah.
injury that we carry
Yeah.
forward, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah. The
Yeah.
adoption. It becomes
yeah,
you,
right.
not the event that you experience. It becomes
Right.
you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's what I
Mhm.
like as a life coach is helping people like build those foundational skills that we talk about. We talk about, oh, I need to have good boundaries, but how do you do that?
Mm.
How do you do
Mhm.
that? Let's practice it.
Mm,
We talk about, oh, I need to have my own back. Okay, but what does that look like? How do we practice that? How can we put that into place? So that's what I love about life coaching is we can put all those things into place so that as you're experiencing traumatic events, as you're experiencing a stressful shift, you have the resiliency to be like, okay, that sucked and I'm
mhm.
okay. I don't have to go home and drink a bottle of wine.
Yeah.
I don't have to like never come back to work, right? I have
Yeah.
the skills to be resilient, to do it in a way that's healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Betty, may I speak to something that you've mentioned? You said earlier that there were these 12-hour shifts, and that tends to be the norm of the industry. And I'm just going to put out my own personal opinion on this, that there are many industries that have structure, such as 12-hour shifts, that lend more to having your staff, this staff that work those 12-hour shifts, prone and prone to having more and more stress and burnout than those that have less time in their industry in consecutive working hours. And then you add to that that your field is high demand, it is high stress, and the level of negative fallout that can go wrong,
Yes.
right, even ups the ante even more.
Yep.
And I feel like there's an accumulative layering of these types of things in the nursing and physician field, caregiving field, that is very still taboo to even discuss or even challenge, right? And those factors are part of what then build these reasons why people end up having burnout.
Yeah.
It's at its core level, the design
Mhm.
doesn't set up people to be able to function in a healthy biological
Yeah.
manner.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's especially true like for our shift workers, right? Our night shift workers. Because I still, I think, yeah, I love my 12 hour. I was gonna say I still love yeah, I do. I love my 12-hour shifts, right? But I have a lot of very carefully placed boundaries. I don't pick up
Yeah.
extra shifts.
Mm.
When I'm working my 12-hour shifts, my family knows that I come home, I drink some water, I might visit for a few minutes, and then I go to bed, right? Like I don't sit up and watch TV. I don't engage in any kind of, talking about what plans we're going to do. I don't do anything. I go straight to bed because I'm protecting the time that I need to sleep. But most people who work in healthcare are not careful with their 12-hour shifts. They're picking up extra because we've got 4 extra days in the week, right? So like I'm going to pick up extra
Mhm.
shifts, right?
Yeah.
So they're picking up extra shifts. They're not engaging in really clear, loving boundaries with their family and the people that they live with. If they're working night shift, they're not doing everything that they can to really support their body in the incredible amount of stress that puts on the body, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, the design of healthcare
Yeah.
is very stressful on a biological level. Yeah. And
Right.
there are ways to mitigate that, but it will, especially for the night shifters, it's not going to change. Um, so how do we support them in that? Give them the
Yeah.
best tools that they can, um, to deal with it. Yeah. It's one of the
Yeah.
one of the first things I tell student nurses and new grads is don't pick up extra shifts. Don't do it.
Nice.
Don't ever do it. Not until you've been a nurse for a year, then you can think about picking up extra shifts. But until
Yeah.
then, no. No.
Good. Great
Don't do it.
advice.
Yeah.
Great advice.
People ask
Yeah.
me that. What's your advice for student nurses and new grads? Don't pick up extra shifts. The money's so wonderful. And
Yeah.
they got student loans and they start
Yeah.
making decent money sometimes for the first time in their life. And they're like, oh yeah, an extra shift. Heck yeah.
Mhm.
Don't do it.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway.
The compromise is somewhere, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Well, and I know from my own research, my dissertation was on nursing and
Mhm.
bringing nurses into the professional field of nursing. And what I found working with the sample that I did was those who made it past 5 years were in the profession long term.
Yep.
But it was kind of that first 5 years was really, really crucial. And you're right, probably that extra burden of picking up additional shifts at a young age and not really understanding how all of that stress is impacting your body. Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
Right.
yeah. And also when you're first new to a profession, you're setting in place your habits. So are your habits going home and drinking,
yeah, so true.
um,
Mhm.
picking up extra shifts, never seeing your family, working all the holidays, right? And what is that setting you up for in 5 years, 10 years, right? Versus setting really good, healthy boundaries in place in those first 5 years, taking care of your
Right.
body,
Mhm.
making sure your relationships are thriving, that kind of stuff. Those first
Yeah.
5 years are so formative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. Great segue from the conversation we had
Thank
earlier
you.
this morning, Michonne.
Yeah, right. The tools and skills of emotional empowerment is what we were
Yeah,
discussing earlier today.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 Wow. Well,
Thank
gosh,
you, Betty.
Betty, we are at time, and it has been a great pleasure to see you again. And I learned a little bit more about your work and how you got into this. So, for our listeners, our nurses, our clinicians, scribes, I think the scribes are really struggling. I hear about
Yeah.
the scribes, and it's heartbreaking.
I actually had a client who did a 12-week program with me.
I was
It
wondering
was
when you
really
said
important. It
18.
was really,
Yeah.
really helpful for her.
Yeah, I'm sure it would be.
Yeah.
So anyone who needs some support,
Yeah.
help with setting boundaries, and understanding what those expectations are, I think particularly as you're a new nurse just starting in the profession. Betty, how can they find you?
Yeah. I'm all over Facebook and Instagram, Aim for Greatness Coaching and aimforgreatnesscoaching.com. So
Aim for Greatness
they
Coaching
can,
and
yeah.
aimforgreatness.com.
Yep. And they can email me directly, Betty at aimforgreatnesscoaching.com. But if you Google Aim for Greatness Coaching on Facebook, Google it, search it on Facebook or Instagram, Aim for Greatness Coaching. Yeah.
Okay.
Very good. We'll make sure that
Thank
that's
you,
in the
Betty.
description box.
Yeah,
Yeah. Perfect.
absolutely.
So thank
Yeah.
you. Michonne,
Thank
anything
you.
from you before we wrap up?
No, it was wonderful to see you today and for having you disclose and share your experience here. One of the things that it is supposed to be a testament of is the ability and the room that we are trying to cultivate for people to actually authentically step in to their truth. And you've done that, and you've given permission for others to do that. That's the work we're doing, is that we get to authentically own what is, and then we can have something to work with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love
So
that.
thank you for that permission. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's an amazing space to be in.
Thank you so much. And thanks for being here. Thanks to our listeners. Please like and click on the subscribe button. Don't smash it, please. But it's brutal language.
Click gently.
And join us in the chat. Ask questions. We'll get back to you. And we'd love to continue the conversation. So again, thank you so much, Betty. And we'll see you again soon.